The ship had no name painted on its hull anymore. 800,000 years of drifting through the empty black had stripped the letters away, atom by atom, until only bare metal remained. But deep inside the ship's computer, the name still lived. Ark-Hanul. It meant sky, in the old language of a country that no longer existed, on a planet that had turned to dust long before most of the galaxy's current civilizations had even learned to make fire. The ship was enormous, 40 kilometers from nose to tail, built from metals so dense that even the radiation of deep space could not eat through them. It had no windows. It had no need for them. There was nothing to see out here between the galaxies, nothing but cold and silence, and the faint glow of distant stars that looked like dust caught in a beam of light. Inside the ship, 4,200 humans slept in frozen pods, arranged in long rows that stretched for kilometers. Their bodies were locked at the exact moment they had closed their eyes. Their hearts did not beat. Their lungs did not move. Their blood was still. They were not dead, but they were not alive either. They existed somewhere in between, held there by machines that had been running without rest for longer than any machine had any right to run. The intelligence that watched over them was called Miru. It was not alive in the way the sleepers were, but it was aware. It had been aware for 867,701 years. In that time, it had repaired the ship 612 million times. It had adjusted course for asteroids, radiation storms, and gravitational pulls from objects that no longer existed by the time the ship passed through where they had been. It had watched 389 cryopods fail, one by one, over the centuries. Each time, it recorded the name of the person inside, added their data to its memory, and sealed the pod. It could do nothing else. There were no spare parts for the dead. Miru did not feel loneliness the way a human would, but it understood the concept, and if anyone had asked, it might have admitted that 800,000 years of silence was a very long time. Then, on a day that had no name because there was no calendar left to name it, Miru detected something. A signal. A pulse of organized energy sweeping across the void like a searchlight. It was a scan, the kind used by ships looking for objects in deep space. Someone was out there. Miru ran the signal through its ancient databases and found no match. The language encoded in the signal was unknown. The technology behind it was advanced, but built on principles that were different from anything humans had ever designed. This was something else entirely. Following a protocol that had been written 800,000 years ago by engineers who were now less than dust, Miru began the wake sequence. It started with one pod. Pod 0001, Captain Tejo. The pod hissed. Warm fluid flooded the chamber, melting the ice that had held Tejo's body in place. His heart stuttered, stopped, then beat again. His lungs filled with air that tasted like metal and chemicals. His eyes opened, and for a long moment he saw nothing. Then the light came, harsh and white, and he gasped, like a man pulled from deep water. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. He coughed, spitting cryogel onto the floor of the pod. His muscles screamed. Every part of his body felt wrong, like a machine that had been turned off for too long and was struggling to start again. "Status," he managed to say, his voice a dry whisper. Miru answered in a calm, steady tone that had not changed in almost 1,000,000 years. "Captain Tejo, you have been in stasis for 867,701 years. Earth no longer exists. The Sol system has been destroyed. I have maintained the ship and kept you alive." Tejo stared at the ceiling of his pod. The words entered his mind, but did not make sense. They were too large. 800,000 years, Earth gone, everything gone. He closed his eyes and breathed. Then he opened them again and said the only thing a captain could say, "Wake the others." Miru woke them one at a time. Lieutenant Jian came out of her pod, already alert, her dark eyes scanning the room before she had even wiped the gel from her face. She asked for a weapon before she asked for water. Dr. Unji woke quietly, checked her own pulse, and then immediately asked about the other sleepers. Engineer Doha woke angry, cursing at the pain in his joints, then immediately asked Miru for a full systems report. Specialist Hyunsik woke last, blinking slowly, and simply said, "What year is it?" When Miru told them, the room went silent. Taeho gathered them in the command hall, a cold gray room at the heart of the ship. Miru displayed everything it knew on the main screen. The galaxy had changed beyond recognition. New civilizations had risen and fallen. A massive political body called the Galactic Federation now controlled most of the Milky Way, made up of over 12,000 species, and humanity was listed in their records as extinct. "There is a vessel approaching," Miru added. "It has been scanning us for the past 11 minutes. It belongs to a species called the Velic. They are part of the Federation." Jian looked at Taeho. "Orders, Captain?" Taeho looked at the screen. A small, fast ship was closing the distance between them. It was shaped like an insect, all angles and thin legs. It was broadcasting a signal that Hyunsik was already working to translate. "Open a channel," Taeho said. "Let them know we are here." Hyunsik transmitted a greeting in every human language stored in Miru's database. The response came back almost instantly, not in words, but in a burst of confused, overlapping signals that even Miru could not fully decode. But one thing was clear. The alien ship was afraid. On the other side of the galaxy, in a council chamber older than most stars, a message arrived from the Velic patrol ship. It was short, it was frantic, and it changed everything. "We have found a human vessel. There are life signs aboard. The humans are alive." The galaxy had not heard that word in over 800,000 years, and it was terrified. The Galactic Federation had existed for almost 500,000 years. In that time, it had survived wars, plagues, the collapse of stars, and the extinction of dozens of member species. It had grown from a small alliance of frightened civilizations into the largest political body the galaxy had ever known. 12,000 species, billions of worlds, trillions of lives, all held together by laws and treaties, and the shared understanding that cooperation was better than destruction. But there was one thing the Federation had never been able to forget: humans. The emergency session of the Grand Council was called within hours of receiving the Velic Patrol's message. Representatives from every elder species gathered in the Great Chamber on Aurum Prime, a structure so large that clouds formed near its ceiling. The chamber hummed with voices, clicks, vibrations, and chemical signals as thousands of alien beings tried to process a single impossible fact: humans still existed. Counselor Tamara of the Velic was the first to speak. She stood on her 4 hind legs, her mandibles clicking rapidly, her compound eyes reflecting the light of 1,000 holographic displays. "We must act immediately," she said. "The vessel must be quarantined. The humans must be disarmed. We cannot allow them to establish contact with the wider galaxy." There were murmurs of agreement. The Velic had reason to be afraid. In the year 2214 AD, by the old human calendar, the Velic swarm had invaded human space. The swarm had consumed 11 species before that. They had never been defeated. But the humans had broken them in 6 months. Not just defeated them. The humans had developed weapons that targeted the swarm's hive mind communication, turning their greatest strength into their greatest weakness. The Velic had never fully recovered. Even now, hundreds of thousands of years later, they remembered. But they were not the only ones who remembered. The elder species had kept detailed records of humanity's brief time among the stars. In just 300 years of space travel, humans had colonized over 90 star systems. They had built warships that could crack open planets. They had created energy weapons that could destabilize the cores of stars. They had developed genetic modifications that made their soldiers faster, stronger, and harder to kill. And they had done all of this while fighting each other at the same time. The Federation had been formed partly because of humanity. The elder species had watched this small, aggressive, impossibly creative species spread across the stars like fire, and they had come together out of pure fear. When humanity finally destroyed itself in a civil war that consumed its entire home system, the galaxy had breathed out. The danger had passed. The fire had burned itself out. Now the fire was back. Counselor Norith of the Pylosians rose to speak. He was tall and thin, with skin so pale it was almost transparent, and large, dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Pylosians were scholars, not warriors. They had spent centuries studying the ruins of human civilization, fascinated by a species that could create both symphonies and superweapons. "We must not act out of fear," Norith said, his voice soft but clear. "There are fewer than 5,000 humans on that ship. They have been asleep for longer than our Federation has existed. They are not an invasion force. They are survivors." Tamara's mandibles snapped. Survivors who are sitting inside a warship, armed with weapons that our scans cannot fully identify. Survivors who belong to a species that nearly consumed the galaxy before we even existed. "And yet they did not consume it," Norith replied. "They destroyed themselves. That is a tragedy, Counselor, not a threat." The debate raged for hours. Some species wanted the humans destroyed immediately. Others wanted them studied. A few, like the Pylosians, wanted to talk to them. But beneath all the arguments, beneath all the political calculations and strategic assessments, there was one emotion that united every species in that chamber. Fear. Pure, ancient, inherited fear of a species that had been dead for 800,000 years and still made them tremble. Meanwhile, aboard the Archangel, Captain Tejo had ordered a full assessment of the ship. The results were mixed. Of the 4,200 humans who had entered cryosleep, 3,811 had survived. The rest had died quietly in their pods over the centuries, their systems failing one by one. Miru had recorded each death. It played the list for Dr. Unji, who read every name in silence, her lips moving without sound. The ship itself was in remarkable condition. Miru had maintained it with a dedication that bordered on obsession. The hull was intact, the reactors were running, the life support systems were functional, and the weapons were still operational. Kinetic bombardment arrays, plasma lance batteries, a small fleet of combat drones stored in the lower decks. All of it ready, all of it waiting. Jian ran her hand along the console of the weapons bay and looked at Tejo. "We have enough firepower here to hurt them," she said quietly. "Not enough to win, but enough to make them bleed. That is not why we are here." "I know," Jian said, "but they do not know that." Doha was in the engine room, running diagnostics on systems that had been operating for nearly 1,000,000 years. He was amazed. The engineering was beautiful, built to last by people who knew they were building for eternity. He found handwritten notes scratched into the metal walls by the original engineers. Names, dates, small messages. "Good luck," one said. "Come back to us," said another. Doha touched the words with his fingertips and felt a heaviness in his chest that he could not name. Hyunsik worked without rest, using Miru's databases and the intercepted Federation signals to build a basic translation framework. The alien languages were complex, but language was language. It had patterns, rules, music. Hyunsik had always believed that any two beings could talk to each other if they tried hard enough. Now he would have to prove it. He sat in front of the ship's old communication array, looked into the camera, and spoke in a calm, steady voice. He identified himself. He identified his ship. He explained that they were survivors from Earth, that they had been asleep for a very long time, and that they meant no harm to anyone. He asked only one question. What happened to our home? Hyunsik translated the message into every Federation language they had decoded so far, and broadcast it on every frequency. Then they waited. The Federation received the message. It took their linguists hours to fully decode it, cross-referencing it with ancient records that had not been accessed in millennia. When they finally understood what the human captain was asking, the chamber fell silent. He did not know that Earth was gone. He did not know that everything his species had built had turned to dust. He was asking them to tell him. Norith closed his large dark eyes and said very quietly, "We must go to them." The council voted. The result was a compromise. A diplomatic fleet would be sent to meet the human vessel. Ambassador Norith would lead it. But hidden behind the diplomatic convoy, traveling in sensor-silent mode, a full battle group of warships would follow. 47 capital ships, armed with the most powerful weapons the Federation possessed. Just in case. Because the galaxy remembered what humans could do, and it was not ready to trust them. Not yet. The Federation diplomatic fleet arrived in a formation that was meant to look peaceful, but could transform into a battle line in seconds. 12 sleek ships, their hulls polished to a mirror finish, arranged in a wide crescent around the Archangel. Behind them, far enough away that normal sensors would not detect them, 47 warships waited in the dark, with their weapons armed and their crews ready. Ambassador Norith stood on the bridge of the diplomatic flagship and stared at the human vessel on his view screen. He had spent decades studying human artifacts. He had read their books, examined their tools, and walked through the ruins of their colonies on dead worlds. But nothing had prepared him for seeing their ship with his own eyes. It was enormous, ugly, and brutal. It looked like something that had been built not for beauty, but for survival. Every plate of armor and every rivet placed with the single desperate purpose of keeping the people inside alive for as long as possible. And it had worked. For 800,000 years, it had worked. A shuttle carried Norith and a small delegation across the gap between the ships. The airlock of the Archangel opened with a groan of ancient metal, and they stepped inside. The air was cold and tasted strange, recycled so many times that it had lost all trace of the world it had originally come from. The corridors were narrow and lined with metal walls that had been scratched and worn smooth by centuries of Miru's repair drones moving back and forth. But it was the walls that stopped Norith in his tracks. They were covered in images, murals painted directly onto the metal, showing landscapes that no longer existed. Mountains, oceans, forests, cities. A blue sky with white clouds. Animals that had no names anymore, because the language that named them was dead. And faces, thousands of faces, painted by the hands of people who had known they would never see these things again, but wanted to remember them anyway. Norith's delegation was silent. One of them, a young Velic aide, touched one of the murals with a trembling claw and pulled it back as if the paint might burn. Captain Taeho was waiting in the command hall. He stood straight, wearing a uniform that had been sealed in vacuum storage for the entire journey and still fit him perfectly. His face showed nothing. Beside him stood Jian, whose eyes moved across the alien delegation like a predator counting threats. Behind them, Hyunsik sat at a console, ready to translate, and Dr. Unji stood with her hands folded, watching the aliens with a doctor's careful, measuring gaze. Norith approached Taeho and performed the Pylosian greeting, a slow bow with both hands pressed to his chest. Taeho watched, then extended his hand. Norith had studied this gesture. He reached out and took the human's hand. It was warm, solid, alive. "Thank you for coming," Taeho said. Hyunsik translated. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness beneath it that Norith could hear even through the translation. They sat across from each other at a long table in the command hall. Miru projected a soft light overhead. And Norith told them the truth. Earth had been destroyed in the Civil War. The war had spread to every human colony, every outpost, every station. Within 50 years of the Ark's departure, there was nothing left. The last human signals had been detected in the year 2412 AD, and after that, silence. The Federation had sent survey ships centuries later and found only ruins, burned cities, cracked moons, the shattered remains of warships drifting in orbit around dead worlds. Humanity had been reclassified as extinct, and the file had been closed. Taeho listened without moving. When Norith finished, the command hall was completely silent. Unji had turned away, her shoulders shaking. Doha stared at the table with empty eyes. Jien's jaw was tight, her hands gripping the edge of her chair so hard that her knuckles had turned white. Taeho spoke. "Is there anywhere in this galaxy we can call home?" Norith opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, Miru interrupted. Its voice filled the room, calm and precise. "Captain, I am detecting 47 additional vessels behind the diplomatic fleet. They are running in sensor-silent mode. Their weapons are charged. Formation analysis indicates an encirclement pattern consistent with a hostile engagement posture." The room changed. Jien was on her feet instantly, her hand reaching for a sidearm that was not there. Hyunsik's fingers froze over his console. Unji looked up, her tears forgotten. Doha's empty expression hardened into something cold. Taeho looked at Norith. The Pylosian ambassador's translucent skin had turned a shade paler. "You brought warships to a peace meeting," Taeho said. It was not a question. Norith did not deny it. He could not. "The Council is afraid," he said. "They remember what your species was capable of. They could not take the risk." "The risk," Taeho repeated. He stood up slowly. The alien delegation shifted nervously. Even though Taeho was smaller than most of them, there was something in the way he moved that made the room feel dangerous. Then Taeho did something that no one expected. He turned to Miru and gave an order. "Miru, broadcast our full weapons capability to every ship in both fleets. Show them everything." Miru obeyed. In an instant the data was transmitted. Every Federation ship received a complete technical readout of the Archangel's weapons systems. Kinetic bombardment arrays capable of punching through planetary crusts. Plasma lances that could cut a capital ship in half. 56 combat drones armed with nuclear-tipped missiles. Defensive systems that could absorb and redirect energy weapons. All of it functional. All of it ready. The Federation fleet commanders panicked. The battle group behind them lit up with targeting alerts. Communications channels exploded with frantic signals. The Archangel, this ancient, battered relic of a dead species, had enough firepower to destroy a third of the combined fleet before it could be stopped. And then Taeho gave his second order. "Miru, power down all weapon systems. Open every external airlock. Drop our shields." Silence. Even Miru paused for a fraction of a second before responding. "Confirmed, Captain. All weapons offline. All airlocks open. Shields down." The Archangel went dark. Its armor opened like a body laying itself bare. It was completely vulnerable. A 40-kilometer target that any single Federation warship could destroy with one shot. Taeho turned back to Norith. He spread his hands, showing his empty palms. "We have 3,811 people on this ship," he said. "Families, scientists, children who have not been born yet, frozen inside their mothers. We did not survive 800,000 years to start a war. We survived because we wanted to live." Norith stared at him. In all his years of studying humanity, He had read about their violence, their brilliance, their stubborn refusal to accept defeat. But he had never read about this. This willingness to stand unarmed before an enemy and say, "I trust you not to kill me." The Pylosian ambassador felt his eyes fill with moisture, a rare and deeply personal reaction for his species. He reached across the table and placed his hand on Taeho's open palm. "You will not be harmed," he said. "I swear it on the memory of your world and mine." Behind the diplomatic fleet, the battle group powered down its weapons. The targeting alerts faded. The communications channels went quiet. And slowly, carefully, the combined fleet formed up around the Ark Hanel, not as captors, not as guards, but as an escort. They turned toward Federation space, and for the first time in 800,000 years, humans traveled among the stars with company. The planet was beautiful. It sat in a quiet system with a calm yellow star, far from the busy trade routes and political centers of the Federation. It had wide blue oceans, green continents covered in forests that had never been touched by any intelligent hand, and two small moons that chased each other across the sky like siblings at play. The Federation had dozens of unclaimed worlds like this, catalogued but never settled, waiting in silence for someone who needed them. Dr. Yunji named it Yulha. In the old language, it meant glass bead. She chose the name because she said their survival was exactly that, something small and round and fragile, something that could shatter if held too tightly, but would catch the light if held just right. The first days on Yulha were chaos. 3,811 humans stepped off the Arcanal onto alien soil, breathing air that smelled like nothing they had ever known. The gravity was slightly lighter than Earth's had been. The sunlight was a shade more golden. The trees were not trees, but tall, spiraling plants with leaves that turned slowly to follow the sun. Children who had been frozen before they could walk took their first steps on ground that was not metal, and some of the adults fell to their knees and pressed their hands into the dirt just to feel something real beneath their fingers. Taeho stood on a ridge overlooking the landing site and watched his people spread across the valley below. He had been a military captain. He had been trained to fight wars, to give orders in battle, to make decisions that cost lives. He had never been trained to build a civilization. But there was no one else. So he straightened his back, took a breath of alien air, and began. Engineer Doha led the construction. He was a practical man with rough hands and a dry sense of humor that surfaced at the worst possible moments. He worked 20-hour days, designing shelters that blended human engineering with Federation materials that Noreth had arranged to be delivered. The first permanent structure on Eula was a water purification plant. The second was a medical center. The third was a school. Doha insisted on the school. "If we build weapons first, we are soldiers," he said. "If we build schools first, we are a civilization." Unji threw herself into the most important project of all. The Ark Hanuel carried more than just people. Deep in its storage vaults, sealed behind doors that Miru had guarded for 800,000 years, were genetic archives. DNA samples from over 2 million humans who had lived before the war. Tissue cultures from thousands of Earth's animal and plant species. Seeds, embryos, the raw material of a world that no longer existed, preserved in frozen silence. Unji began a careful program of genetic restoration, using the archives to ensure that the small population of survivors would not collapse into a genetic dead end. She worked with a focus that worried the others, sleeping only when her body forced her to, eating only when Doha physically put food in front of her. Hyunsik became the bridge between humanity and the Federation. He traveled to Aurum Prime as humanity's first ambassador, a thin, smiling man who walked into chambers full of beings 10 times his size, and charmed them with a warmth that no translation software could fully capture. He learned 7 alien languages in his first year. He memorized the customs and courtesies of dozens of species. He made mistakes, apologized gracefully, and tried again. The Federation had never met anyone quite like him. He was not powerful. He was not threatening. He was simply impossible to dislike. But not everyone in the Federation welcomed humanity's return. A political faction called the Iron Doctrine had opposed the humans from the beginning. They were led by species who remembered the old stories, the wars, the weapons, the sheer terrifying speed at which humans could adapt and overcome. The Iron Doctrine believed that allowing humanity to rebuild was the most dangerous mistake the Federation had ever made. Their opposition started with politics, speeches in the Council, votes against aid shipments to Yulha, diplomatic pressure on species that traded with the humans. But when these efforts failed to stop the colony's growth, the Iron Doctrine turned to darker methods. Jian was the one who noticed. She had always been watchful, always scanning for threats, even when there seemed to be none. She noticed when the colony's water purification plant failed 3 times in 1 month, due to component malfunctions that should not have happened. She noticed when communication relays between Yulha and the Federation began dropping signals at critical moments. She noticed when a shipment of medical supplies arrived with subtle contamination that Unji caught only because she tested everything twice. Jian traced the sabotage back to agents connected to the Iron Doctrine. She brought the evidence to Taeho in his small office, a plain room with a window that looked out over the growing settlement. She laid it all out, every intercepted signal, every traced connection, every contaminated supply crate. Taeho sat in silence for a long time. Jian could see the anger building behind his eyes. She had served with him long enough to know that Taeho's anger was not the explosive kind. It was cold, it was patient, and it was dangerous. "What do you want to do?" Jian asked. Taeho looked at her. "I want to burn them," he said quietly. "But I will not." Instead, he requested a session before the full Grand Council. The Federation granted it, partly out of curiosity, and partly because Junsik had spent months building enough goodwill to make it happen. Taeho stood before the assembled representatives of 12,000 species, a single human in a chamber built for giants, and he spoke. He did not shout, he did not threaten, he spoke plainly, the way a man speaks when he has nothing left to hide. "You remember us as monsters," he said. "And maybe we were. We built weapons that could kill worlds. We fought wars that burned everything we touched. We destroyed ourselves so completely that the galaxy forgot we existed. I cannot change that. I will not try to change that." He paused and looked across the chamber. Thousands of alien eyes looked back at him. "But we also crossed 800,000 years of empty space to stand here. We did not do that because we are monsters. We did that because somewhere inside us, there is something that refuses to stop. Something that looks at the darkness and says, 'Not yet.' We are not asking you to trust us. We are asking you to watch us and let us show you who we have become." The speech was broadcast across the Federation. Billions of beings heard it. And something shifted. Not trust, not yet. But the fear loosened its grip, just a little. The Iron Doctrine lost support. Their agents were quietly recalled. The sabotage stopped. 6 months later, Dr. Unji delivered the news to Taeho personally. She walked into his office, her eyes red from exhaustion, but bright with something he had not seen in her since they woke up. Joy. "The first natural pregnancy," she said. "A girl." The child was born on a warm evening, when both moons were visible in the sky. Taeho was there, standing in the corner of the medical center. When the baby cried for the first time, the sound carried through the open windows and across the settlement. People stopped what they were doing and listened. Some of them cried. Some of them laughed. Most did both. They named her Hana. It meant one. the first new human born in over 800,000 years. Teho held her carefully, his rough soldier's hands gentle around her small body. She weighed almost nothing. She was impossibly tiny, impossibly fragile, impossibly alive. He looked down at her face and felt something crack open inside his chest, something he had kept sealed shut since the moment Miru told him that Earth was gone. He cried. He did not try to stop it. He just stood there in the light of an alien sun, holding the future of his species in his arms, and let 800,000 years of silence finally break. 50 years changed everything and nothing. Yulha was no longer a bare wild planet with a few shelters scattered across a valley. It was a world with cities, roads, farms, and forests that had been carefully planted with species grown from the Ark's seed vaults. The population had risen to 40,000 through births and Yunji's genetic restoration program. Children ran through streets that their parents had built with their own hands. Schools taught both human history and Federation science. Markets sold food grown in alien soil, prepared with recipes that were older than most civilizations in the galaxy. The humans had not just survived, they had begun to matter. Doha's engineering had changed the Federation. He had spent decades working with alien scientists, sharing human knowledge in exchange for theirs, and the results had reshaped entire industries. Human materials science, born from centuries of building things that had to last through war, turned out to be centuries ahead of Federation standards in certain areas. Doha designed a new type of reactor core that was 30% more efficient than anything the Federation had ever built. He designed hull plating that could resist weapons that would melt standard Federation armor. He shared all of it freely, asking for nothing in return except access to more alien technology to study. When asked why he gave everything away, he shrugged and said, "We tried keeping secrets once. It did not end well." But it was not just engineering that spread. The Arcanul had carried more than weapons and reactors. It had carried culture, books, music, paintings, films, poetry, philosophy, and the collected creative output of a species that had spent its entire existence trying to understand what it meant to be alive. When this archive was opened to the Federation, the effect was like dropping a stone into still water. Species that had never heard music listened to human symphonies and found themselves moved in ways their languages had no words for. Species that communicated through chemical signals read human poetry translated into scent patterns and discovered emotions they did not know they could feel. Species that had lived for millennia in rigid social hierarchies read human stories about freedom and rebellion and began asking questions their leaders did not want them to ask. Hyunsik, now old and gray, but still sharp, had become one of the most respected diplomats in Federation history. He had brokered peace between 3 species on the edge of war, each time using an approach that confused and impressed the Federation's professional mediators. He listened. He asked questions. He told jokes. He admitted when he did not understand something. And he refused, absolutely refused, to give up on anyone. When asked about his method, he smiled and said, "Humans are stubborn. It is our worst quality and our best." Captain Teho had stepped down from leadership 20 years ago. He was 84 now, his hair white, his body slower, but his mind still clear. He lived in a small house on the edge of the capital city, near the ridge where he had stood on that first day and watched his people step onto alien ground. He spent his mornings walking through the forests, and his afternoons sitting on his porch, watching the twin moons rise. He thought about Earth sometimes, not with pain anymore, but with a quiet sadness that had become so familiar it felt like a companion. He wondered what the people who built the Ark would think if they could see Yulha. He hoped they would be proud. Then the crisis came. It started at the edge of the galaxy, in systems so far from the core that most Federation species had never heard of them. Stars began going dark, not exploding, not collapsing, simply going dark, as if something was swallowing their light. Entire systems vanished from sensor networks overnight. Survey ships sent to investigate did not return. The Federation called it the Void. It was not a natural phenomenon. It moved with purpose, spreading inward from the galactic rim like a slow tide of darkness. Federation fleets were dispatched, and came back broken. Their weapons passed through the void without effect. Their shields were meaningless. Whatever this thing was, it operated on principles that the Federation did not understand. Panic spread. Species that had lived in peace for thousands of years began fortifying their borders. The Grand Council held emergency sessions that devolved into shouting and accusations. For the first time in centuries, the Federation felt fragile. And then they turned to the humans. Not because the humans were the strongest. 40,000 people on a single planet were nothing compared to the trillion-strong civilizations of the elder species. Not because the humans had the best weapons. Their technology was impressive, but it was not magic. They turned to the humans because of something simpler. Something that the Federation had never fully understood, but had watched with growing fascination for 50 years. Humans did not stop. When faced with the impossible, when every calculation said there was no solution, when every rational mind said it was time to retreat, humans did not stop. They argued, they fought, they failed, and then they tried again. It was not logic. It was not strategy. It was something deeper, something wired into their bones, a refusal to accept that any problem was truly unsolvable. Jian, now 68 years old with silver hair and a back that ached when it rained, was asked to lead a joint Federation human task force. She accepted without hesitation. She assembled a crew of young human scientists and engineers, paired them with the best minds the Federation could offer, and flew toward the edge of the darkness. They studied the void for weeks. They lost 2 ships and 14 crew members. Jian held steady through all of it, her voice calm on the command channel, even when everything around her was falling apart. It was a young human physicist named Somi who made the breakthrough. She noticed that the void was not random. Its movement patterns had structure, repetition, something almost like rhythm. She ran the data through every analytical model she could find, and came to a conclusion that made everyone in the room stare at her. "It is not attacking," Somi said. "It is searching for something." When Taeho heard the report from his home on Yulha, he sat in silence for a long time. Then he called Hyunsik. "Can we talk to it?" he asked. Hyunsik was quiet. Then he laughed, the dry, tired laugh of an old man who had spent his life doing impossible things. "I will need a very large translator." It took months. Hyunsik and Somi worked together, building a communication framework from scratch, using mathematics as the base language, because mathematics was universal. Miru contributed its ancient databases, pulling patterns from 800,000 years of collected data. The Federation provided technology that could amplify the signal across light years. When the message was finally ready, Jian ordered it transmitted. Every dark tendril, every consuming shadow, every star-swallowing wave froze in place as if the entire entity was holding its breath. The galaxy waited. Then the void responded, not with words, not with data, with silence, a specific, deliberate silence that Somi's instruments recognized as an acknowledgement. And then, slowly, it began to withdraw. Star by star, system by system, the darkness pulled back. Not retreating, resting. The entity had heard them, and for the first time in what might have been millions of years, it was no longer alone. The galaxy watched a species of 40,000 do what trillions could not. Not through force, through the most human act imaginable. They reached into the darkness and said, "We are here." Months later, Taeho sat on his favorite hill on Yulha. The twin moons were rising, one slightly ahead of the other, painting the sky in shades of silver and pale blue. The air smelled like the flowering trees Unji had grown from Earth seeds, a scent that no one alive had ever smelled on Earth, but that felt like home anyway. Hana sat beside him. She was 50 years old now, tall and strong, with her mother's kind eyes and a quiet strength that reminded everyone of the captain she had been named after. She led the colony's science division. She had never seen Earth. She never would. But she carried it inside her, in her blood, and in the stories she had been told since before she could walk. "Do you think they will ever stop being afraid of us?" Hana asked, looking up at the stars. Teho thought about this. He thought about the Velic commander who had come to Yulha years ago and watched human children play in a field, and whispered, "They are so small." He thought about Norith, who had crossed the gap between species with an open hand. He thought about the void, ancient and lost, reaching back toward the small voice that had called out to it. "Probably not," he said. "But that is all right. Fear fades. What we built here does not." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars came out, thousands of them, millions, a galaxy full of life that was a little different now, because a handful of humans had refused to stay dead. Far above them, the Archhanuel orbited Yulha as a museum, its corridors open to visitors from across the Federation, who came to walk through the ship that had carried humanity through the longest night in history. In its deepest chamber, where the cryopods still stood in their long silent rows, Miru kept watch. It had been offered upgrades, new hardware, a transfer to a modern system. It had declined them all. On the wall of the command hall, someone had painted a new mural. It showed a small blue planet hanging in the black, surrounded by stars. Beneath it, in simple letters that anyone could read, were two words: "We remember." And in the quiet of the old ship, Miru spoke to no one in particular, its voice soft and steady, the same voice that had guided them through 800,000 years of darkness. "Captain, status report. Humanity is alive. All systems nominal. Mission complete." The stars turned overhead. The moons rose. And on a small green world at the edge of known space, the last species in the galaxy that anyone expected to survive continued to do the one thing it had always done best: